Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Timothy here with Jank Diver Gaming, back with another mid-season update to our Unrestricted Cube. For those who don't know, we like to do these mini updates around the halfway point between major set releases on Arena. With the D&D core set still almost 2 months away and Historic Anthology 5 dropping on Arena, now felt like a good enough a time as any to tighten up the list a little bit. We've got around 20 cards to discuss here, so a little on the shorter side, but that's appropriate for one of these mid-season updates. As always, you can subscribe to this channel for more updates and content like this, and you can find links to our Twitter and Discord below if you're interested in trying out the cube for yourself. Alright, let's jump into the update. We'll kick off the white section with one of our new Historic Anthology cards, one that we've been clamoring for since we first got into the Historic Cube game. Intangible Virtue is finally here, and it's one of the best token payoffs we could have asked for. Admittedly, I was only thinking about this card in the context of Peasant Cube, where we'll certainly be playing it, but Chris convinced me that there's just enough token generation across enough different colors that this will function as a powerful, cheap Anthem effect for a wide variety of white-based decks. There's a lot more token generation than I assumed at first blush, and it is one of the sub-archetypes centered in Selesnya, so it kind of makes sense. Expect to hear about this one again in the Peasant video, but for now, we'll see how it does in the higher power level environment. Angelic Ascension was brought in recently, and while Chris and I both suspect there's a lot of potential to the card, it's not a necessity for white decks to pick it up, so we doubt it'll be missed by anyone. Historic Anthology 5 brought with it two pretty splashy cycles, one of which are the new Phyrexian Praetors, a cycle of top-end boss creatures that grant you a benefit while imposing the opposite detriment on the opponent. Elish Norn is the highlight among the bunch as a 7-mana 4/7 with Vigilance that grants your team +2/+2 while giving your opponent's board a persistent -2/-2. Elish Norn doesn't have an ETB effect per se, but its static ability has such a major effect as soon as she hits the board that she can completely reshape the landscape of the battlefield. It's not inconceivable for Elish Norn to bring you from losing the game to immediately winning in the span of a turn or two, assuming you get to cast her. 7 mana is a lot, especially for a white deck, but the payoff is worth the investment, and you can play her alongside ramp spells or reanimation to maximize the chances of landing her. She's one of two Praetors from the cycle that we're ecstatic to pick up, and she's an easy replacement for Harmonious Archon, a top-end white creature that just doesn't pique the interest of many players. Archon was a card that we tested for quite a while. It was in the original build of this cube, but it's pretty clear that the 4/5 fly-in body breaking the symmetry of its other abilities just isn't something that white decks need to spend 6 mana on. There are plenty of other Anthem effects floating around at much cheaper costs, and they almost always get the nod. Perhaps a touch less exciting is a swap back for Venerable Knight over Toolcraft Exemplar. I maintain that in the right types of decks, Toolcraft Exemplar is one of the best 1-drops you can ask for, but in reality, those decks don't come together too often, and our players don't seem interested in putting in the extra work during the draft to maximize its power. It routinely goes last pick, and I'm finally ready to part ways and sub it out for the Savannah Lions that it replaced. Venerable Knight is boring, and its ability is next to nothing, but even so, the white beatdown decks are just interested in Savannah Lions regardless of upside, and we're reversing this swap. Everyone knows by now how much Chris and I both love Dominaria, so it only takes the slight mention of a Dominaria powerhouse to convince the other that it's cube-worthy. Lyra Dawnbringer is the big winner this time around, and honestly, it's always been a cube-worthy addition. We omitted it from the initial list because we suspected too many cards like this would edge out aggro decks, but aggro's been crushing it lately, even with the addition of similar cards like Aethersphere Harvester and Noxious Gearhulk. We're learning that we can take the gloves off a little bit and make room for top-end finishers that turn the corner against aggro decks, and Lyra's just fine as a control finisher if that's how she gets played. This could have easily been Baneslayer Angel 2, but the random protection ability seemed like an unnecessary addition to the package we wanted in this slot. Not sure we need to go into depth about why we cut Eidolon of Obstruction, but the exchange does up White's curve a little bit, so we'll be keeping an eye on that in the future. Blue starts out with the OG itself, Merfolk Looter, the creature from which the term looting originates. It might look a little innocuous, but a mana-free loot every turn adds up significantly over the course of a game in terms of smoothing out your draws and shaping your hand, and we suspect Looter will strengthen the graveyard interaction in blue, if only by a little bit. It's the golden standard for this type of card, and I suspect we'll be playing it until we get access to Jace Vryn's Prodigy, and even then, we might play the cards in tandem. The cut was Thieving Skydiver, which is occasionally very powerful, but rarely much more than a simple Welkin turn. Cards that interact with artifacts lose a bit of their appeal when the artifact section we're running is already a bit on the skimpy side, and while the dream exists to cast Skydiver and kick it to steal and auto-equip a Bone Splitter, for example, that just doesn't come up enough to warrant this card's inclusion for now, even more so now that we're trimming on our artifact section a little, which I'll explain at the end of this update video. The other blue pickup from the Anthology was Whirler Rogue, an old mythic uncommon from Magic Origins. It's a 4-mana 2/2 that brings along 2 Flying Thopters as friends, and additionally allows you to tap any 2 untapped artifacts to make a creature unblockable for the turn. Even without the evasion clause, Whirler Rogue is enough power packed into a single card and works fantastically in any go-wide deck or a blue-white blink deck looking to double up on ETB effects. Again, another card that will 100% make it into the peasant list while standing its own against the big dogs in the unrestricted cube. Spark Double is out to make room. We've tried a couple iterations of different 4-mana clones at this point, and they all end up in the medium to good camp, but rarely are they that good. Spark Double has the unique quirk of copying planeswalkers and legendaries, but when the functionality only exists on paper and never comes up during gameplay, it makes you second guess whether the card's fit for the cube or not. Ultimately, we decided no. Next, we're going to pick up a Strixhaven card we originally passed on with the first run through the set. Multiple Choice was a card we were curious about, and having played with it in Set Limited and hearing some glowing reviews from other cubers, we're ready to test it out. It's a curious modal spell that doesn't exactly highlight a particular strategy in general, but it's potent enough as a standalone spell that we feel like the power level is there, especially given that the X=1 cycling mode helps dig out of mana problems in the early game. I tried my best to hold on to Alrund as long as possible, and while I'm quite fond of the card, specifically the back half Haka, people look down on Alrund, and I'm ready to clip its wings. It was fun to play for me, and only me, and I wouldn't be surprised if I'm the only person who ever really gave it a shot. Accompanying Elish Norn in Grand Praetordom will be Shieldred Whispering One. It's generally a second-tier mainstay for reanimation decks in Legacy and Vintage cubes, and while our reanimation package in the Unrestricted cube is a bit lacking, Shieldred is a perfectly castable creature with an imposing presence on board. Repeated edicts and reanimation each turn cycle is usually enough to win the games, and Swamp Walk isn't nothing either. Ultimately, Shieldred is a great addition to a deck that isn't fully fleshed out on Arena yet, so it feels as though it should only get better with time. We gave 4-mana Liliana a second chance, and I'm landing pretty firmly on just saying that Waker of the Dead isn't a good card. Having to put the work in to make her -3 a removal spell really hurts the reliability of the card, and it's difficult to break parity on the plus ability. I doubt we'll be seeing her again anytime soon. Red didn't quite get there in the Anthology, but we're making a couple minute swaps elsewhere. We've been jonesing to test out Ox of Agonis for a little while now. We have it pegged as a card that doesn't quite get there yet, but given that we know we want to try it out at some point, we figured now was just as good a time as any. Obviously, the Ox is at its best when you can turbo through your graveyard, so we envision this as a payoff for grindy black-red decks using the self-mill cards in black to feel escape on cards like this and Kroxa. We also recently picked up Faithless Looting and Conspiracy Theorist, which fall in line with this strategy as well. On top of that, Ox of Agonis is a perfectly reasonable creature to play at the top end of a curve-out red deck capable of emptying its hands quickly. All these factors led us to believe it could impress us, so we're giving it a chance. We both think Sarkhan the Masterless is a good card, but it's underperformed our expectations. I think part of the problem is that players see Sarkhan and try to make a Super Friend style deck work, which just isn't fully supported in this cube. Sarkhan's at his best when you're just trying to beat down, and even then you've got plenty of other options to choose from in the 5-drop slot. I won't say this is a permanent goodbye for Sarkhan, more like a temporary leave of absence. The other red swap falls in line with the same kinds of decks we're trying to support by including Ox of Agonis. Devil's Play is a fireball variant with some functionality from the graveyard. The flashback half of this card isn't great, but it is a bonus on an otherwise playable fireball, and that's a fine place to be in, especially when you consider the times you get to discard or mill over Devil's Play for value. It seemed like a reasonable replacement for Immolating Gyre, a card I had high hopes for but ended up having too high of a setup cost. See, the thing is, Immolating Gyre has really high upside as a potential one-sided sweeper. Unfortunately, there are times where you just don't have enough spells in your graveyard to make it kill what you need it to. If you're going to spend 6 mana on a sweeper, it needs to be consistent. Perhaps the right call is to return Hour of Devastation to the cube to keep the number of sweepers the same, but we're going to feel out this swap for the time being. Green's in much the same position as red, with nothing super exciting from the Anthology, but still receiving a couple minor swaps. For one, we want to try out Llanowar Visionary in the Unrestricted cube. It's hard to find anything wrong with the card. Maybe it's a touch weaker than some of the rare level acceleration like Selvala or Rishkar, but replacing itself on ETB is valuable, and it's been a staple of Peasant ramp decks. I imagine Visionary might fall in line with cards like Cloudkin Seer and Frost Trickster, obvious Peasant staples that fall just shy of the barrier to entry for higher power level cubes, but we'll see. Jadelight Ranger was the cut, and once more, there's nothing exceedingly wrong with Jadelight Ranger. It's a good value creature with some minor graveyard synergies, but it's not a pivotal piece of any given deck, and so it's a creature that's perfectly cuttable for something new. Sometimes you have to come to grips with the fact that a pet card of yours just isn't as good as you want it to be, and I think that's the case with 3 mana War of the Spark Vivian. In theory, the card should be quite good, digging for extra creatures and allowing you to play at instant speed, with a reasonable +1 as well. Unfortunately, the -2 whiffs often enough to make Vivian a bit embarrassing at times, and being able to flash in creatures only changes the dynamic of the game so much. We wanted this around to signal our desired Simic Flash deck, but the problem is, if that deck actually exists, then your creatures should already have Flash, and if the deck doesn't exist, well, Vivian doesn't exactly make the deck exist on her own. She's a cool card, but an underperformer, and we made a tough decision to remove her. Scoot Swarm's back in all of its degenerate glory. Green-White Tokens has gained some tools since the last time the Swarm was around, and cards like Intangible Virtue and Essica's Chariot makes us think there's some merit to giving it a second spin. We've already mentioned the Praetors as the big headline and cycle from Historic Anthology 5, but equally impactful are the Dragons of Tarkir Commands, some of the most flexible and well-designed spells I've ever played with. Ojutai's command is the first of the bunch that we'll be using. For 4 mana, you can reanimate a creature with mana value 2 or less, counter a creature spell, gain 4 life, or draw a card. And as with all of these commands, you get to pick the best 2 for whatever situation you're in. The small ball creature reanimation is the trickiest part of the card, since blue-white decks aren't typically dense with small creatures, but when you do pull off that mode, the card is the real deal. The other combination of modes play well for control decks, which is where blue-white tends to find itself more often than not. Deputy of Detention's in timeout for being just a little worse than it seems. There are a few blue-white decks looking to leverage small creatures in white and blue tempo plays to beat the opponent down, and there Deputy is quite good. But even in those decks, it's not better than, say, Skyclave Apparition and Friends, and Deputy's quite bad in dedicated control decks. If you're the hard Azorius control deck, your opponent often ends up with uncastable removal spells, so if you plan on answering a threat with Deputy of Detention, odds are it'll be answered right away. It's slightly overshadowed by some monocolored cards, so it doesn't feel like a big loss to remove it. Our Rakdos section has been hanging on to some less than stellar cards for a while, but thankfully the Anthology gave us a pretty heavy hitter in Kolaghan's Command, which feels like an upgrade to Angrath's Rampage. I found Rampage to be playable but undesirable, and it feels like Kolaghan's Command will cover much the same ground while being even more versatile. It's a better shatter effect when that's relevant, it can rebuy a creature from the graveyard, the shock effect can be aimed anywhere, and on top of all of that, you have instant speed discard, which can be a gnarly effect against a top deck and opponent. It's an excellent pickup for the cube, and a clean swap for a less reliable removal spell. Keeping in line with expanding graveyard interactions in red and black, we plucked Cut to Ribbons from the card file for our trial run. We're maybe a little suspicious that this is just going to be an expensive flame slash and not much else, but it's not hard to imagine a red-black deck getting some extra mileage out of the back half. It's very similar to Devil's Play in that regard, using the back half to burn an opponent out, but the color restriction is a bit more specific. It's a decent card to incidentally mill over, and it feels like a nice card to include in the package with Ox of Agonis and friends. Regardless of whether it makes the cut, no pun intended, we felt that it was time for Fireblight Artist to go. You really need to plan out how you're using your sacrifice fodder in dedicated sacrifice decks, and rarely is it right to chuck creatures at the Fireblade Artist ability for some extra damage. 2/2 haste for 2 is a decent stat line, but if that's all we're getting, we can clearly do better. Selesnya picks up the final command with Dromoka's Command, which for just 2 mana can prevent damage from a spell, have target player sack an enchantment, dump a +1/+1 counter on a creature, or function as an instant speed fight. More likely than not, this ends up being an instant speed pump plus removal spell for just 2 mana, which is great, but when the lesser modes come up, they really matter. Blanking a burn spell or a damage-based sweeper, or forcing your opponent to lose a crucial enchantment are both relevant abilities that will show up from time to time, and coupling those with one of the other abilities can lead to some pretty swingy turns. It's efficient and powerful, and we had an easy cut with Battle for Bredegard. Despite being a deliberate payoff for green-white tokens, the saga is too slow and the third chapter is way too easy to play around. It's a cool design, but poor in execution, so it's out for Dromoka's Command. We're making a change to our Gruul section that I'm not sure is 100% correct. See, poor Gruul is an undervalued deck, very good when it's drafted, but drafted very infrequently. This leads people to believe that some of the Gruul cards aren't very good given the frequency at which they play against them. Quartzwood Crasher is one such casualty of this line of thought. I found Crasher to be excellent in decks that support the mana cost, but the data shows a bit of a story. It has a high win percentage and a low draft rate, which tells us that people don't take the card very often, but when they do, it wins pretty frequently. I'm not sure why, but we get a lot of feedback about how this card isn't good, and I couldn't disagree more. Regardless, if our players aren't going to draft it, then trying something else out incentivizes people to play Gruul a bit more. We're willing to find a change. As such, we're bringing in Klothys, a hard-to-deal-with ramp piece that also serves as a persistent source of damage and incidental graveyard hate. I'm a little concerned that Klothys isn't a great fit for a Gruul deck, since Klothys is rarely a creature, and Gruul decks usually want to be beaten down, but it can't be denied that Klothys is a powerful card, so we're bringing it in over the Crasher to see if it pushes people into Gruul a bit more often. We knew we wanted to test out Extus almost immediately after our original Strixhaven update, but decided to table it until now, where we're subbing it in over Yarick the Desecrated. Yarick's been around since the onset of the Unrestricted Cube, and it holds its own, but it advertises a Sultai ETB value deck that only partially exists. Green offers very little in the way of valuable ETBs, and blue-white gets a lot of the ETB support, so Yarick's just a little bit off in terms of the deck it's encouraging people to draft. We've seen it do plenty of cool and even degenerate things, but we like to keep this multicolor section small, so we had to cut one of these gold value creatures. As for Extus, we are intending to run it as a Mardu card, since you'll almost always try to find some free red sources for the back half of the card, even when you're only really intending to run the front half. Black spells will have to pull the heavy lift in for Magecraft triggers, but rebuying a creature every time you cast or copy a spell is pretty nutty, and Awaken the Blood Avatar is just enticing enough of a card that the entire package was something we were eager to get our hands on. Finally, we're going to do some minor restructuring of our colorless section, dropping 5 of our clunky, underplayed artifacts for the 5 Ikoria Triomes. I've been weary about the Triomes from the very beginning, because mana fixing this good can lead players to draft 4 or 5 color good stuff piles, and if too many players do that at the same time, it train wrecks the entire draft. However, the rewards for doing so aren't changing, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem as long as we limit the number of multicolor payoffs we include. Players seem excited about the Triome's potential to unlock certain 3-color archetypes that suffer due to low mana fixin', things like Mardu Aristocrats for example, so we'll see how it all pans out. I'll briefly go over the 5 artifacts we decided to cut, starting with Captain's Hook. This is a remnant of when we tried to support red-white equipment, a short-lived deck that needed a density of colorless equipment to pan out. Turns out it didn't pan out, and with most of the pieces already removed, we were just waiting for some better colorless cards to show up before ditching Captain's Hook. We're not really getting those in any hurry, so we're just dropping it all together for a trial. Hope of Girapur was another tragic inclusion that was meant to simply fill up space in the colorless section due to just not having better options. It replaced something pretty bad while just being a lackluster card itself, and was another easy card to trim for the colorless section. From time to time, I'll see Sorcerer's Spyglass come down and shut off a key Planeswalker, but problematically, the cards are good enough in the cube that simply trading 1-for-1 with the Spyglass isn't exceptional. Either you name a card in their hand that they haven't had to spend mana on yet and they just cast something else, or you name a Planeswalker on board that's likely already given them some sort of advantage. You're usually at a disadvantage either way. I think it's important for us to remember that we're playing a singleton format, and cards like Sorcerer's Spyglass lose some of their constructed luster when you only ever shut off one card in your opponent's deck. Here's my hot take for the update. Icy Manipulator is not a very good cube card, and I don't just mean here, I mean for Peasant Cube as well. Icy has a pedigree in limited formats of being a troublesome card to beat, with Dominaria being the most recent example of that. However, I find that Icy does not live up to that legacy in cube environments. Again, this isn't a retail limited set. Everything your opponent plays is going to be good. Tapping their best threat down each turn matters very little when everything they play is a threat. There are plenty of decks that can function off of very little mana as well, so the land tapping ability rarely matters. It only really comes up against mana-screwed opponents, in which case you want something a little more proactive than Icy Manipulator to take advantage of the situation. Icy will continue to ravage limited formats when it shows up, but I don't think it translates into cube very well. Panharmonicon is the final cut from the artifact section. Panharmonicon is the final cut from the artifact section. See what I did there? I said it twice because Panharmonicon? Get it? Anyway, this is such a clunky payoff, intended to work in the blue-white blink decks, but between cards like Thassa, Ephemerate, Yorion, and Momentary Blink, that deck has the pieces it needs without having to take a crucial turn-off to land this artifact. I've tried drafting Panharmonicon for these decks, and I find that I never really get a turn to safely set up and cast it. It's always been one of my favorite cards, but I think it's clear now that the Unrestricted Cube is not the right home for it. That's everything for this update. How'd we do? Did we miss anything important in the historic anthology? Are we sleeping on the other Praetors and Commands? Should we uproot everything and make snow work so we can play into the north? Let us know what you're thinking in the comments below, or come find our Discord and try out the cube for yourself. As always, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and find our Twitter if you want to engage with us directly. This has been Tim with Jank Diver Gaming. Thanks for watching. I'll catch y'all next time.